You're under arrest. Stop challenging me. Then tell me what law I broke. You
Are
don't
you
question my
absolutely
authority.
sure about that?
You're afraid to answer. Enough. You're going to the holding cell for asking a question. Just move. You don't make the rules here. Are you sure you want to do this? The handcuffs closed around her wrists with a cold mechanical click that echoed longer than it should have in that quiet marble lobby. Sheriff Dorian Kessler stood over her, his voice flat and final, the voice of a man who had said the same sentence 100 times before to 100 different people. You're under arrest for resisting authority. The woman did not beg. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, steady and unhurried, and asked a single quiet question that hung in the air far longer than 4 words should. Are you sure you want to do this? Kessler smirked, called her difficult, uncooperative, and ordered her taken to a holding cell without another word. He had no idea the woman in front of him was not an ordinary citizen, that the calm in her eyes was not fear waiting to surface, but patience waiting to be proven right. Less than 10 minutes later, the phone at the front desk began to ring, sharp and insistent. A voice on the other end announced itself with 4 words that would change everything Kessler thought he understood about that day, about his authority, and about the woman he'd just placed in a cell without asking a single real question. This is the White House Situation Room. The lobby of the Redmont County Administrative Building smelled like old paper and cheap coffee. At 9 a.m., it was nearly empty, except for a woman at the front counter, waiting. Her name was Zariah Voss, 39, in a plain gray coat, her posture calm but unmoving, like someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of power. She had come to request public records she believed she was legally entitled to see, and said so clearly, without repeating herself more than necessary. The clerk shifted uncomfortably, glanced toward a back office, and said the files were unavailable, that she'd need to come back another day, that the request needed an approval no one behind the counter could actually name. Zariah didn't argue. She asked the same question again, in the same even tone. Which statute allows you to deny me access? No one answered. The clerk grew visibly more nervous, disappearing into the back room twice, while Zariah stood exactly where she was, hands folded, eyes steady, refusing to leave until someone gave her an actual reason. That refusal alone was enough to summon a man in uniform. Sheriff Dorian Kessler, 52, broad-shouldered, used to being obeyed the moment he entered a room, didn't ask what had happened. He looked at Zariah for 2 seconds and decided, without evidence, that she was the problem, the way he'd decided about dozens of people before her. You're causing a disturbance, he said. Zariah calmly asked him to state the legal basis for that claim. Kessler measured respect by how quickly people lowered their eyes, and Zariah wasn't lowering hers. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he told her. She answered without flinching. I'm asking a question you don't want to answer. That was the moment everything shifted. Kessler ordered her hands behind her back, the charge vague by design, disorderly conduct, failure to comply, language flexible enough to justify almost anything, and specific enough to survive almost no scrutiny. Zariah didn't resist. As the door swung shut behind her, she turned her head slightly and said one last thing, so calm it barely sounded like a warning. Remember exactly what you just did. Kessler laughed under his breath, certain he'd just handled a difficult woman on an unremarkable Tuesday. He had no idea he'd just placed his hands on something far larger than himself. The holding cell was small, gray, and smelled faintly of bleach. Officers expected tears or pleading. Instead, they found Zariah sitting perfectly still, breathing even, hands loose in her lap, as though waiting for a train. She asked precise, methodical questions one after another, the arresting officer's name, the exact time of arrest, the stated cause in full rather than a code, which camera had captured the incident, whether the footage was stored locally or backed up elsewhere. A young officer, Casey Lindholm, found herself unsettled by how fluently Zariah spoke, as if she understood the machinery of the system better than the people running it. Zariah never mentioned what she did for a living. Kessler wandered past the cell, unable to resist one last jab. You think you're some kind of lawyer? Zariah looked up without a trace of anger. No, I just know my rights. Frustrated that there was no crack of fear to widen into control, He told his officers to write the report so it framed her as combative, insisting the paperwork reflect resistance rather than compliance. One young deputy hesitated, glancing at the ceiling camera that clearly showed otherwise, before the pressure of a badge and a paycheck won out. Zarya heard it all through the thin walls and said nothing, only glanced at the clock and murmured, just loud enough for Lindholm to catch, "They'll start looking for me in a few minutes." Lindholm had no idea what she meant, only that the certainty in her voice didn't belong to an ordinary detainee. A second, older officer stopped by out of curiosity, asked gently if she wanted water, if she was comfortable, if there was anyone to contact. She declined all three and told him, without hostility, "You're not the one I have a problem with," a sentence that unsettled him more than he expected. Lindholm lingered too, noticing how Zarya tracked every officer who passed, not from fear but from habit, the way someone notes the exits in an unfamiliar room. When Lindholm finally asked if she'd done this before, Zarya only offered a small, unreadable smile. Then, down the hallway, a phone began to ring, and something in the sound made even the seasoned officers pause. The dispatcher, Peter Ashworth, picked up expecting a routine call. Instead, a composed, unfamiliar voice asked, "Is Sheriff Dorian Kessler available?" It gave no name, only 4 words that made his stomach tighten. "This is the White House Situation Room." He set the receiver down slowly and walked stiffly to find the sheriff, his face pale enough that 2 deputies stopped to watch him go. Kessler took the call with visible irritation, sure it was a prank. The voice was measured, unhurried, entirely without humor. "Release the woman currently in custody." Kessler laughed and asked who exactly he thought he was talking to. The voice didn't raise in volume. It simply recited details with unsettling precision, her full name, the exact time of arrest, the building's address, even the internal case number Kessler had barely glanced at. The blood drained from his face with each detail. "Who is she?" he finally asked, smaller now. "That is not information you are authorized to know." Kessler tried to reassert control, reminding the caller this was his jurisdiction. The voice didn't argue. It simply said one thing that rearranged everything he thought he understood about the last hour of his life. "You just arrested a woman actively engaged in a federally classified assignment." He lowered the phone, hand trembling, and turned toward the hallway where Zarya still sat exactly as he'd left her, spine straight, utterly unbothered. Their eyes met, and the corner of her mouth lifted into the faintest, most knowing smile, not triumph, not mockery, just the quiet expression of someone who'd been waiting for the truth to catch up to the room, the way it always eventually did. What Kessler couldn't have known was exactly who Zarya Voss really was. She held a senior position within a specialized federal agency tasked with quietly assessing vulnerabilities across the country's public institutions, infrastructure, local governance, the systems ordinary citizens relied on without ever thinking twice. Her work demanded absolute discretion, no trace, no headline, nothing that might tip off the people her assessments were designed to observe. She never traveled with an escort or a business card revealing her rank, because the value of her role depended on no one recognizing her at all. The documents she'd requested that morning were tied to an active federal review already examining irregularities in how local authority had been exercised across several jurisdictions, quietly underway for months before she ever set foot in that lobby. Kessler had seen only a woman without a badge or escort, without the deference he expected, and filled in the blanks with the same assumptions that had shaped how he treated people for 20 years, unchecked. What he didn't know was that Zarya hadn't simply come to inspect paperwork. She'd come to watch how the sheriff treated someone who appeared to have no power at all. She wasn't only investigating a set of files, she was evaluating the entire system around them, the habits, the small casual cruelties that accumulate over years until they become invisible to everyone except the people on the receiving end. A former colleague once warned her that if a local official ever learned who she truly was, his behavior would turn performative instead of honest. Her answer, in the same calm tone she carried everywhere, "And that's exactly why he isn't allowed to know." The truest measure of character, she believed, showed only when people thought no one who mattered was watching. Back in the hallway, Kessler's mind raced, searching for a version of events where he'd somehow been right. He returned to his office and found a message glowing on his screen through a secure federal channel his department had never used. Federal Review, immediate action required. His pride curdled into fear he had no framework for managing. His first instinct was concealment, the same instinct that had carried him through 20 years of unquestioned authority. He quietly ordered 2 loyal deputies to delete informal notes from that morning that documented his exact words. One deputy, Marcus Webb, hesitated at the door. "Sir, I don't think we should be touching anything right now." Kessler snapped, "I'm the one who signs your paychecks," words that had always worked before, but, for the first time, didn't land. Instead, Webb quietly saved a complete backup of the building's security footage before anyone could erase it, copying the files to a drive in his own pocket. Meanwhile, Zariah remained unmoved, asking for no lawyer, no outside call, her silence unsettling Kessler more than any protest could. He finally walked to the cell himself, his tone awkwardly softer. "Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." Zariah looked up without anger. "No. You were very clear." When he insisted this could still be resolved quietly if they worked together, she answered, "You're trying to manage the consequences, not cause." Then she made a request that would prove far more damaging than he anticipated. To see the official arrest report he'd signed less than an hour earlier. He handed it over. Zariah read it slowly, and her gaze stopped halfway down. Something in the wording didn't match what she remembered. "Sheriff, who told you to change this line?" Kessler denied it immediately. But Marcus Webb had already anticipated the moment, producing the earlier draft he'd discreetly saved and sliding it across the desk. Side by side, the difference was impossible to explain away. The original stated plainly that Zariah had not resisted and had complied fully. The revised version, bearing Kessler's signature, claimed she'd physically resisted, a claim the footage and his own deputies contradicted. This was no longer poor judgment. Altering an official report was a far more serious offense on its own. Another call came through, this time without pleasantries. "We've received the complete footage," the caller said. Kessler, his throat dry, asked the only question left. "What do you want from me?" The answer came back simple and devastating. The truth. Later that day, someone from the federal team asked Zariah whether she intended to pursue formal charges against Kessler personally. She sat with the question a long moment before answering. "I want to know how many people this happened to before me." The room understood instantly. This was no longer about one arrest, one sheriff, one bad morning. It was a pattern no one in a position to notice had ever bothered to look at closely. At her request, investigators began pulling records back years, cross-referencing arrest logs against the same vague, familiar language, being difficult, failure to comply, disrespecting authority, not legal terms, just excuses dressed up to look official. Case after case surfaced of people who'd simply refused to be intimidated into silence and had no money for a lawyer, no connections to push back. A young man arrested for asking why his car was towed. An elderly woman held overnight over a citation issued in error. A teenager held for hours after refusing to apologize for something he hadn't done. Laid out together and cross-referenced by date, officer, and outcome, the individual incidents stopped looking like isolated judgment calls and started looking like a consistent method of control disguised as routine policing. Kessler tried to shift blame to his deputies, but his signature appeared on the majority of the approvals, year after year. Investigators found a case nearly 9 years old, a man named Thomas Riley, arrested outside a grocery store after asking why his vehicle had been searched without consent, in language almost identical to Zariah's file, at a time when none of the department's cameras were even functioning. Riley spent 2 nights in a cell and never got an apology. There was Denise Calloway, too, a young mother detained nearly 6 hours over a citation she believed was issued to the wrong vehicle, her complaint buried in a filing cabinet and never escalated. When investigators told her by phone that her case was being reopened, she asked only whether anyone would have ever looked at her file again if the woman from the White House call hadn't been arrested first. Once the pattern became undeniable, Zariah confronted him directly. "Power isn't measured by how many people are afraid of you," she said, with no anger, only exhausted clarity. Kessler tried to explain the pressure of the job, the county that wanted results and measured him by how orderly the streets looked, rather than how fairly they were policed. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," she answered. "I understand it. But pressure doesn't give you the right to turn a citizen into a criminal." Within hours, an emergency suspension order arrived through the same federal channel. Kessler realized there was no version of this story left where he walked away unchanged. His access to internal systems was revoked. His badge was logged into an evidence locker for the first time in over 20 years. A federal review team moved through the station within days, interviewing deputies one by one. People who'd stayed silent for years began to talk. One admitted he'd been pressured more than once to adjust report wording to make arrests look justified. Another came forward with internal emails showing a pattern of instructions from Kessler over the years about which citizens deserved extra scrutiny and which complaints could be ignored. What began as one questionable arrest expanded into a formal investigation of an entire department's decade of practice. Before leaving the building for the last time as sheriff, Kessler asked to speak with Saraya privately. She agreed, more for closure than obligation. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were from the beginning?" he asked. "If I had told you," she said, "you would have treated me differently." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She continued, "I needed to know how you treat someone who doesn't have any power at all." In that moment he understood the full weight of his failure. Not that he'd broken a rule, but that somewhere along the way he'd stopped seeing the people in front of him as people at all. The investigation concluded weeks later and became the opening chapter of a much larger reform effort. Every arrest would now require a specific written legal basis instead of a vague template phrase. Body camera footage became mandatory and retained rather than conveniently deleted. Old cases across multiple counties, some decades old, were reopened. Saraya was invited to speak before a small gathering of federal and state officials. She spoke not about herself, but about the people who never had a Saraya Voss walk into their case, the ones who simply paid the fine they couldn't afford or spent a night in a cell because arguing felt more dangerous than compliance. Her closing line was quoted in memos and hearings far beyond that room. "Justice is not the powerful treating the powerless with kindness. Justice is the powerless still being protected, even when they make the powerful uncomfortable." The silence that followed carried more weight than applause. Kessler faced legal consequences and the permanent end of his career, his name attached now to a case study rather than a commendation. The story was careful not to paint him as a singular villain, but as a symbol. What happens when power operates for too long without anyone watching closely enough? A habit calcified over 20 unquestioned years. A working group formed within the state's oversight office to review how vague justifications had survived so long in official paperwork. Saraya sat in on 2 early sessions as an outside advisor. When an official asked what a department could do differently starting on day 1 of reform, her answer was simpler than anyone expected. Write down the real reason, not the reason that sounds safest to write. It became one of the group's core requirements, printed at the top of every new incident report template distributed statewide. Not long after, Zaraya's phone rang again with a different tone. Another assignment, another town, another system, waiting unknowingly for someone to walk through its doors and ask one uncomfortable question no one wanted to answer. She left Redmont quietly, without procession or cameras, the same way she'd arrived, a woman in a plain coat, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate by anyone who judged worth by volume rather than substance. But everyone who'd witnessed what happened understood now that her calm had never been weakness, that stillness could hold more authority than any raised voice, and that the quietest person in a room is sometimes the one holding all the power within it. Kessler sat alone in what remained of his office, watching the security footage from that first morning, his own recorded voice sounding almost like a stranger's. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He sat with the words a long time, understanding that the sentence had stopped being an accusation against her and had quietly become evidence against himself. Outside, as Saraya walked to a waiting car, a colleague asked if she believed any of this would actually change anything meaningful. She considered it carefully. "Not immediately, but maybe next time someone will remember they didn't have to stay silent." It wasn't a promise of sweeping transformation, something smaller and sturdier, a belief that one moment of refusal could ripple outward into a hallway or lobby she'd never stand in herself. She stepped into the car. Her phone buzzed once against her palm. A new message, brief and unadorned. Next review location confirmed. She looked at it a moment, then turned the screen dark and set the phone in her lap, the way she'd done 100 times before and would do 100 times again. The car pulled away, and Redmont County disappeared slowly behind her. Another chapter closed, another quiet, unfinished story left for someone else to carry forward. Not every battle begins with raised voices or drawn weapons. Sometimes it begins with a single calm woman asking a simple question no one wants to answer. I just want to know what my rights are. And somewhere, a system built on unquestioned authority learns far too late that the person they tried to silence was the very person sent to hold them accountable, the very person whose stillness had been the loudest warning of all.